This is the February 2022 version of the Mount Vernon Clinic, which is a function of the 4th Division PNR and MRA.
Well, I'm going to invite you to try scratch building with some small utility buildings that I have been working on for my small yard area, and I hope we'll have fun. We all know that railroads have a lot of small buildings. These are just some images that I picked up off the internet in a very abbreviated search. Each of you may have many photographs of such buildings. I got really turned on to the potential of these small buildings for my scratch building interest by an RMC article, Railroad Model Craftsman, a fairly old article, 2013 by Bob Bennett. This was a Boston and Maine prototype that he wrote this article about. And I didn't build it in 2013. I think it was probably only 4 or 5 years ago that I built this model. And this is how it looks on my layout. I will not be talking about this particular model, even though I still really like it. I think it's cute because I failed to take enough photographs during the construction process. So there was nothing really to show. Now there is a Banta kit that will build this model. That was not available when I started. I'm more of a modeler than I am a railroader. I prefer planning and building or operations. Sometimes it's embarrassing to think how long it's been since I last operated my layout, but I do have a layout. It's an 11 by 14 ON30. Has lots of structures because I like to build structures. The 1/4" scale is really good for scratch building. In fact, some of the tips that I will show you tonight might not work as well in HO scale and probably not at all in Z scale, so be it. The era of railroading that I'm really interested in is mid 20th century. And my layout is set in 1940. And everything I model is weathered. So it is maintained. I'm not portraying a lot of dilapidated equipment, but it's definitely worn, ready for paint, so forth. And I like to experiment with materials and techniques. What I hope you will see tonight is I will describe 5 small projects, all illustrating different methods and materials. It's not step by step. You wouldn't go away and build exactly the same model, but I think there'll be enough detail to provide some ideas and tips. It'll also encourage you to try scratch building if you haven't done so. The first 3 projects I want to talk about were based on a substructure of gator foam. And they're a yard office, a storage shed, and a pump house. If you haven't worked with gator foam or aren't aware of gator foam, you may be in the minority, I don't know, but this gives you a little introduction. It's like foam board that you would buy at the art store, but it's, I think, a denser foam, and it's a distinguishing characteristic is that the 2 sides are each sheathed with wood fiber veneer, 1/64 inch thickness approximately. The result is a 3/16 inch panel. It's very strong, lightweight, and warp resistant. It just feels much stronger than the regular foam board. You can cut it with a knife or a saw, and this slide shows an example of a fairly complicated, if you will, structure that I was preparing with foam core. The first building that I want to talk about is this little yard office. It was stimulated by a 1956 model railroad article. Incidentally, at one time I had a complete collection of model railroader clear back to the mid 1940s. I got rid of it when they issued their DVR 10 years or 15 years ago that had all these old issues. And because it was just taking so much room, I mean, 60 years of magazines is a lot. But then within just a few years, they no longer supported the DVDs. You know, the operating system of your computer was updated, and somebody's not making all the necessary transitions. So that was no good. Now I subscribe to Model Railroaders. The proportion of my subscription includes access to their perennial index. So at least now I can get back to these articles, but I still wish I had the magazines. Anyway, this was a freelance project, but it was based on this 1956 article by Paul Larson, who was a long-term editor of Model Railroad. I use TurboCAD for a lot of my planning, and I established certain dimensions that I thought would work best on my layout, and laid out these plans on TurboCAD. And then I plan to continue my experiment with a kind of board and batten siding where the boards in the background are actually just colored paper, and the battens are little wood battens, and I'll show you some more of that. This incidentally is the same gator foam example or gator board example that I showed you in the previous example. And the board and battens here are wooden battens on a paper background, and the same on this little outhouse. To build this yard office that I'm talking about, I used the gator foam core, and I used a method that is common with styrene modeling, but I'm not sure what to call the method. I call it here the cut segment method. But instead of taking a sheet of material and cutting the openings for doors and windows, instead of cutting the openings from a sheet material, the openings are formed by the way pieces are assembled. So that's what I used in this case, because I had lots of little bits of gator foam left over from other projects. These angles up here in this first slide should be disregarded because the actual slope of the roof is set later. But this shows how I was connecting these slices together, and this is the result for the wall that had a window opening. Then I backed the openings with heavy black construction paper because it would help provide some strength to those butt joints. But mainly because I was not going to put any interior detail in the building, and I didn't want any untoward reflections or anything like that. So this is the way the siding works. I printed lines on 12-inch centers on ordinary printer paper. And then I outlined those wall pieces for on the paper. And when I work with wood, which is my typical medium, I dirty almost everything with an alcohol wash, a very thin alcohol wash, before I begin. In this case, I dirtied the walls with pan pastel smeared on with a sponge. The pan pastel color that I like for that purpose is called Raw Umber Extra Dark. It's a very brown charcoal color. I use pan pastels a lot. Then I painted the walls with also with pan pastels, using a color that's kind of pretty close to an ordinary boxcar red, called iron oxide. Oh, iron. Does anybody spell iron that way? Iron oxide extra dark. And notice that in neither case am I trying to get coverage like you would with a paintbrush. I'm trying to get a finished effect that shows variation from board to board. Then I cut out the colored paper sides and ends, glued them to the gator form box, and then cut out the door and window openings with razor blade. And here I'm shown adding the pre-colored battens, and the corner trim had already been added before this photo. By the way, I use Aleene's tacky glue and the syringe very extensively for almost everything. The door and windows in this case were Grant line castings that I had in my scrap box. I sprayed them with Rust-Oleum camouflage sand and then dirtied them. with pen pastels and finish the color with a pastel called Permanent Red Extra Dark. It's a little redder than the boxcar red that I referred to in the previous slide. The doorknob is something I found at Joanne's Fabric called a bridal lace pinhead, and it's exactly the right diameter for a doorknob in O scale. And then I put it into punched it into a brass colored little piece of paper for the backing. I kind of gouged up the situation in the application, and so I envision that it's gouged up because the door was jimmied at some point. Some pest person thought they were going to get something interesting in a yard office. I don't know. The windows were glazed with slide cover glass. If you haven't tried side cover glass, it's worth trying because the effect is very nice, but it is kind of a pain. Clover House offers these segments of very thin glass. It's actually a 6/1000 of an inch thick, and the paper that I made the previous board and batten siding from was 4/1000 of an inch thick. So this is pretty thin glass. The thinnest Lexan or styrene, clear styrene that I've found for glazing windows is 5/1000. So the glass is pretty thin. And this shows how the size 2.5 by 9 inches or 2.5 by 1 inch basically lays over a common window size. So you can do good sized windows, but you can't do big picture windows with this kind of stuff. And then the other option on the internet is regular slide covers, which are like only 7/8 by 7/8 of an inch. They're probably actually millimeter measurements, but you can get 100 of them for $6 on Amazon. I looked recently. Then you use a diamond scribe like this thing I got from Clover House and a straight edge scribe. I found that if I scribed each direction and got the pressure just right, lightly but firmly, then I could snap it off with the pliers and it would work fine. You have to be prepared for a lot of waste because this glass is fairly fragile and it will occasionally break after you've installed it, which could be a real pain, but I'll show you an example later of how that can be made an advantage. And then I install it with PSA, and if you haven't used this stuff, this is the tip of the evening. PSA, pressure sensitive adhesive, is kind of like the stuff they use to put on your counter laminates and so forth. But anyway, you just apply it along the edge of where you're going to mount a glazing, a window. It is white as a liquid. It dries to clear, but it stays sticky. And so then you drop the glass on it and you don't get any squeeze out at all. It's wonderful for that purpose. For the roof on this office, I had a roof from another project, which it happens to be another project I'm going to talk about later in the clinic. It was a pretty nice roof. It had individual cedar shingles. It scratch built skylights. In its previous life, it had this elaborate inner structure, prototype structure, and I didn't need that, but I thought I could trim that out and still make the rest of the roof useful. And I didn't like it for the other project, so that's what I did. I was able to remove all of that inner rafter structure without any damage because it had been installed with Aleene's tacky glue. Tacky glue, I mean, that's the biggest advantage of tacky glue in some ways. It's not only sticky, but it stays flexible and you can take it apart. I like it. I had to cut down the width of these segments a little bit, but the length was just right because I thought this out in advance. So I added a ridge support in the building I'm working on, and the roof fit fine. And so all I needed was some trim on the ridge, and I used just 1x6 in this case. This is a little bit of a plug for a tool. This Ultimation sander, which many of you would be aware of, is a very nice tool. I avoided it for a long time because it's manually is cranked, and I thought it would be slow and tedious. And I had a 9-inch disc sander that have been using for a decade, and was, I use it almost every day, and it's really a good tool. But it turns out that this Ultimation sander is also a very nice tool, and I'm kind of a tool junkie. So I got one of these. This arm sticking out here on the side is a repeater, and it can be adjusted for angle with this knob. And it has this spring-loaded pusher to push the work into the sander, and then this micrometer knob here that allows you to adjust the length. So you can duplicate parts to exactly the same length, and I mean literally within 1/1000th of an inch. What I'm showing here is that I made because these rafter tails that I want to trim are so small, they're hard to handle. So I made this little carriage with just a couple of pieces of strip wood. And here I am set up to turn the crank. Here I've turned the crank, ground off the end of this, so I have the angle correctly the way I want it. And in this slide, I'm installing those rafter tails. Now that's a lot of work just for a few rafter tails that you could cut off with a razor blade. But I just wanted to demonstrate that if you care about precision, you can do more. Then I added a Grant Lane smoker jack and guy wires that are terminated at a styrene plate here with nut and bolt castings on the roof. This photo illustrates something that photos will do for you with modeling, and that is it shows me that I didn't do a very good job on these guy wires. They're brass wire, but they're not straight and like tensioned brass wire, or like tensioned guy wires would be. So photos are a useful tool for modeling. Then I wanted a coal bin on the side of this little shed, and I did this a little differently than I would probably have just glued up the panels and stuck them together, but here I used I made corner posts, not pots, of 2x4s, and then I added the boards one at a time, 1x4 planking, using this arrangement to keep things in order, square. Put in a plywood bottom, did create a panel for the top. The hinges are just paper. And then I added some coal, and the hood, the lid is propped up. Notice the damage here on one of that was deliberate damage on one of the planks. And this is the final result. This is the probable location of this on my layout. It's not actually permanently installed there yet, and you can see there's no scenic material around this area, but it's on the edge of a little cliff overlooking a river, and it's on a peninsula where it can be viewed from both sides, so it's fairly prominent. The next building I want to talk about was the storage shed, and I'll move a little faster probably because I'm using more time than I expected. I don't have as many construction photos of this shed as I would like, so there are more words here than you really want to know, but Anyway, it's a gator foam box. Window and door openings were cut only to the inner laminate layer. You remember the gator board has two layers of wood fiber, or one layer on each side, and so I just cut through the outer layer and the foam. Then I wrapped it with 3-foot wide tar paper using black construction paper, and put on these 1x2 nailers and 1x4 corner trim. The strip wood doors and windows were built in place, and the rafters are 2x8 filler boards, and the foundation are 8x10 beams down here on the foundation. All the strip wood, I think I mentioned earlier that I always weather it and age it a little bit. All my strip wood was pre-weathered and stained with, in this case, with thinned Hunterline cordovan brown, a really nice stain. But I need to thin it quite a bit. I don't want a dark stain. I thin it with 2/3 alcohol. And the roof, this is an interesting technique that you might find useful. I just lay some tissue, Kleenex kind of tissue, across the roof, plywood segment for roof, and spray it with flat black paint. The paint is the adhesive to stick it on the roof, and then weather it with pan pastel. This is an interesting little cart that was a train troll kit. They call it a fish cart. And it was, I got suckered into buying it at a train show, and I intended to always use it somewhere in the yard, but I decided that it would go well with this shed I had just built. And so I was going to put a lean-to on the shed as a home for the cart. I started with rear frame and put it right on the building, but then that left me with some issues I want to get to in a minute. Notice the weathering on the door, or at least the grain on the door. The padlock is probably a little larger than scale, but it's just a chunk of styrene with wire, very, very fine wiring. Assembling this leg assembly for the lean-to was actually kind of difficult. I saw a hint recently where somebody used foam insulation board, that 1-inch thick, fairly dense foam insulation board as a work board for projects. If I had thought of fastening these legs somehow to a piece of 1-inch foam insulation board, I might have saved myself some trouble. But anyway, the way I approached it was I constructed first this front leg assembly. I could do that flat on the ground, and included the braces and so forth. So it was a freestanding thing. Then I could just prop it up plumb with the wall and add these horizontal attachments and get that part started. Then I added these angle braces for the roof and made them longer than they needed to be so I could trim after I had the thing assembled. So, and then I put in the outside rafters and glued to these angle braces, and then trimmed off the angle braces. And all of this was facilitated by using the Aleene's glue that I like so much. I don't have any financial interest in Aleene's. I just think it's a great product. And it worked well here because it's flexible. And so things needed to be wiggled a little bit to get everything plumb and so forth. It worked. Then I added the rafters and furring strips, and the roof of the lean-to is corrugated paper roofing. I think mine was from Simpson, but I believe there are several companies that have corrugated paper in various scale sizes. And I sprayed it with Rust-Oleum primer and weathered with pan pastels. And noticed a little bit of rust on the nail heads and the extra weathering on the hinges and around the bottom of the door and so forth. And this is the final result. And this is the thing installed at my layout. It happens that the area around this is a little more complete than what I worked on before. Sometime I'll tell you about the barrel rack and stuff like that. The next project was a brick pump house. And the interesting thing about this is that these are individual bricks. And they are made of wood. I had done one previous experiment with individual bricks. This happens to be a pump house. Also, I guess I used pump houses to play with bricks because pump houses are small and bricks are small. But this was a styrene brick situation where I laminated styrene sheet to a block of wood. And then I chopped bricks from from styrene strips, and in putting them on, gluing them to the styrene backing, I spaced them by eye, but I horizontally by eye, but I separated the courses by styrene strips that were slightly thinner, narrower than the bricks themselves. So I left a place for a grout and or mortar, I should say. And so then I painted them red and filled the mortar lines with water putty, and it turned out okay. But I'm basically a woodworker, so I wanted to try it with wood. And so I experimented first. I chopped up a bunch of bricks with from a 2x4 strict wood, and separated the courses with styrene strip, which I had originally intended to be removable. But I found that removing the styrene strip was not a good idea. It was better to just glue it in place. So that's what I did in the future. I glued the styrene strip in place, but it was still thinner than the wooden bricks, so left room for the mortar. And then I sprayed with, or I colored it with spray of this claret wine color. So I started my new pump house with just a gator form box. I used glue blocks in all the corners to make it stronger. Actually, I found that laying the individual bricks across the foam corners was a bit of a problem. And so if I do this again, and I probably will do it again, I won't do this butt joint. There are several alternatives that I think would work better. One would be just to take a piece of ordinary transparent tape and tape across that butt joint. I think it would be thin enough not to be an issue. Or I could put a corner post in the corner, or I could miter that joint, or I could use a rabbet joint. I think, Ted, I believe you in your clinic last week, you had something that involved a rabbet joint with foam board.
Yeah, I use a balsa stripper to cut.
Yeah, that's what
cut
it was.
the.
Well, I would use a router, but anyway, yeah, same idea. So then I started applying these bricks, and I've forgotten to count how many bricks there were. I could estimate it now, but I haven't estimated how many bricks there are. But what I did was work up from the bottom. I finished a side before I turned it over and started another side, so that I always had a flat surface to work on. And the first few rows needed to be backed by an angle plate or some other thing. I suppose you could even stand it on end, but that didn't work for me very well. But you need to have some surface to push against to get all these bricks in place. And then I went back and finished the corners after I had done the adjacent sides. I didn't try to do the corners as I went, but finished them later. And then here's a slide showing how I was working around the door opening. And then I spray painted it and applied the mortar. I always use Durham's rock hard putty for mortar. Just have to remember to wipe it off before it gets very dry. Then I made the strip wood door, built it right in place. And the plywood roof is covered with sandpaper strips. And I added a brand line, the electrical meter. These are resin castings, electrical meter and little wires, and made this roof vent out of a wood block with angle styrene and a corner cap, and the tar around the roof vent is tube acrylic. I think Mars black, but I'm not sure about that. And then it was all lightly weathered with pan pastels and alcohol stain. And this is where it will sit on my layout, next to this water tower, and the yard shack, yard office I was describing in the beginning is just off the film here, just off the slide to the left. The last two projects I want to talk about are based on prototypical board by board construction. One is an open storage shed and the other is a speeder shed. This is the open storage shed. The framing I did with, I had this styrene tray I built that's a very useful assembly tool. It's just a sheet of 40,000 styrene. I think it's 4x4, it might be 6x6, with 1/8 inch square material around one corner. And these spacers are are cut exactly to the space required for 2x4 framing on 16th inch centers. And so then here I am in the process of framing up a wall. The top and bottom can be made a little longer than necessary, and the corners are double 2x4s. Then I joined the wall frames and began adding the floor. This slide shows that the wall plate, the top plate on the back wall is double thickness because it needs to support the roof rafters. Then here I'm starting to add the floor, and of course it was added on the bottom of the. But this is a top side view, but it was added on the bottom of the walls, 2x8 flooring. And then here I finished the flooring and added a front beam of double 2x8s and some rafters of 2x6s. And then the front beam is braced with these 1x4 angles. Here I added foundation timbers, 12x12s I used in this case, and put 1x6 nailers on the roof. And then I sheathed the ends. In this case, I just kind of playfully, I used corrugated iron on one end and strip wood on the other. The corrugated iron is paper, the same material that I used on the roof of the previous shed, and sprayed with gray primer and then rusted with pan pastels. The strip wood is colored with pan pastels, same ones I've used before, mostly raw umber extra dark and red oxide extra dark. Here I shows the sheathing on the back, again, 1x10 strip wood, and the roof is, I think, HO scale, but anyway, it was ribbed scale metal from, I believe, Rib Builders and Scale. sprayed with Rust-Oleum primer and rusted with pan pastels. This kind of mess down here in the corner, I had intended that there would be a patch of tar paper or a poster or something down in here. So I glued it on, and then I decided I didn't like it. So when I took it off, this is what was left. And looks fine to me. I mean, it looks like ordinary weathering sort of. And this is the open storage shed that's ready for my layout. I added the angle bracing here on the inside, and this little shelf, and the rest of the stuff is mostly things for my junk box. I have a big junk box. And this is where it fits on my layout. This is a blacksmith shop. This is an engine house. They're both on a peninsula, so it's accessible from both sides. It's maybe 18 inches back from this side to the shed, and 15 or 18 inches back from this side to the shed. And obviously, I have still quite a bit of landscaping to do in this area, but it's coming together. The final model I want to describe is this speeder shed. I always liked the shed that was described by Bob Boudreau in the 2011 130 annual. And finally, a few years ago, I got around to building it. I drew up plans for my particular application that showed the 2x4 framing. I made a base from a piece of plastic laminate, but I mean the kind that you use on countertop or something. I do that kind of stuff too. So I have scraps around, and I painted it tan, laid down the code 70 rail, and ballasted it, and added a little bit of ground cover. And then I made these indexing strips so that the speeder shed could drop down over it. I made a foundation of 3/16 by 1/4 inch strip wood, and I mitered the corners, and then painted it gray so that it would look like concrete. You can see I weathered it some too. Glued in the code 70 rails with ACC, and framed the walls with 2x4 strip wood using techniques I've already described, and I glued the walls to the floor. Then the sheathing was colored by first dirtying it, and then coloring it with red oxide, extra dark pan pastel. And the door was made from strip wood and uses a Grant Line boxcar hardware. The lower track was fabricated with styrene. I believe it involved both a strip styrene and a U-shaped styrene, so that, and not bolt washer castings. Anyway, the door slides easily back and forth. The windows and skylights were cut of strip styrene, brush painted with polyscale, and glazed with microscope slides. I used these kind of jigs for building windows. And then I had a removable rafter system. This little bit of styrene jig facilitated it. It followed, I think, prototype practice even around the windows. And then I added 1x4 furring strips for 6-inch shingle reveal. I had in mind, frankly, when I built this, a contest model. That's why I put so much detail into the roof. But at the national meet in NMRA meet in Portland, I got enough points for a merit award, but I sure didn't get a lot of feeling that anyway, it just turned out that this kind of model is too simple, just a square box, even no matter how complicated you make it, is not going to be a contest winning model. The shingles were left over from an earlier project. I cut them all from a cedar plank. I cut 4 different widths, thinking that if I randomly kind of scrambled those 4 widths together, it would look like what you buy at Home Depot. And they're a nominal 18-inch length, and so that makes a 6-inch reveal, and that's what I arranged for here. And here I'm aligning. This is partway through the installation. You can see that the chopping of the shingles results in enough variation. The chopping of the shingles resulted in enough variation that there's some exaggeration in the final result of the variation in shingling. I mean, shingles are not all the same length, but there is some exaggeration of that in this. But I mean, generally, the effect is pretty good. The bottom row has to be started somehow so that the angle of the shingles is appropriate. And this was my solution. I used 8-inch wide shingles and then 3-inch wide shingles all laid horizontally along the lip of the roof. And then I started the diagonal shingles. This was a coal bin, in this case, a very simple one. It's just a block of wood with an angle on one side and paper hinges and a wood chip handle. And this model had a lot of interior detail. The stove here was out of a Bachmann coach. The heat shield is a styrene sheet with some nut bolt washer castings for detail. The shelf is one of those rusty rails castings, which is a kind of an epoxy resin casting. The workbench was built from strip wood, and the other details are all basically from the scrap box. The ashes are actual wood ashes. And so this is where the model ended up originally. But this is the one that I didn't like the way the roof fit. The angle of the roof wasn't quite exactly the same as the intended pitch. So that's the roof I stole and used on the yard office described earlier. So I built a new roof for this model with plywood sheets and balsa angle braces, sprayed it all flat black, and then cut roofing panels from corrugated aluminum strips. And I think these are, again, HO model, Campbell, I believe. But anyway, there's something I just had on hand. Sprayed them with gray primer, and then sprayed most of the panels with dark rust. And this is another hint that you should write down because it's very useful. This dark rust is 1/3 roof brown and 2/3 rust, and it's a very useful color. That's not, I don't know where that idea came from. I didn't make it up, but anyway, it's a very useful color. I applied then those panels with double-sided tape and weathered with pan pastels. And I depicted a few panels being replaced later. So this is that final model. And this is the way it sits on my layout. It's near a coaling station at the end of my yard, and it is landscaped. So that concludes what I had to say. Ted? Any questions or comments? Oh, and if anybody wants to follow up, this is my email address down here.
Yeah, Ron, back to we were cutting the microscope glass. When you scribe that, what kind of surface do you lay the glass on?
I do all my modeling on a glass surface. just a piece of plate glass, like a desktop,
Yeah, okay,
like a desktop thing.
yeah. So you're just laying that glass on the glass when
Yeah,
you scribe it.
right.
Okay. Any other questions for Ron?
Like many modelers, I switched from HO, and it's true that there's enough difference that it takes quite a while to get used to the volume of O scale buildings and structures after you've been in HO scale. And I'm noticing here one thing I forgot to point out on this slide. Notice the broken window here. One of the advantages and disadvantages of using glass for glazing is that the disadvantage is that it's fragile and it breaks easily. The advantage is that even if it breaks after you've already finished the model, it looks like broken glass. And so since I model buildings that are not brand new, that's perfectly acceptable to me. And that looks a lot more like broken glass than a scribe mark on a piece of plastic looks like broken glass.
You further identify that PSA? Is it a glue or?
Yes, it's pressure sensitive adhesive is what the PSA stands for. And I got mine from Micromark. I don't know how readily available it is. If you went to Home Depot and asked for PSA, I don't know if you get any or not.
You
Microsoft-
probably not, because I think that PSA is just a proprietary name for that Micromark put on it.
Oh, I never thought of that.
Yeah,
Well, if Micromark carries it, that's close enough. I
yeah.
didn't know they had that. Okay.
No, I for the characteristics you described for the PSA, I find that the canopy cement works very similar,
Ah, okay.
and that's available from a couple different manufacturers,
Yeah.
and it dries perfectly clear. So that's why it's good for glazing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I don't know how clear the actual, I don't know how clear the PSA actually is, but I do know it doesn't squeeze out.
Yeah, well, if it doesn't squeeze out, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's true.
Ron, a question. Did you have any trouble keeping the brick coursing aligned as you worked around the building?
Actually, I do. I've been experimenting with making brick chimneys,
Mhm.
and I found, to my surprise, a while back, that a chimney I had been working on, when I got about I don't know, 15 or 20 courses high, it was slanted. I mean, it was cattywampus. I don't know what the right word is, but the top was far from level.
Mhm.
And I think there are a variety of reasons for that, but I haven't completely gotten a solution yet. I don't think, though, on a wall, even a small wall like this pump house, I don't think that's too much of a problem. But I didn't notice any real problem with it on the pump house, but on chimneys, I have noticed a problem. And the length of the bricks is a real problem with chimneys, because if you just cut your bricks, whether they're styrene or brick or whatever material, you just cut them with a chopper, they vary in length by plus or minus 10 thousandths, which is a whole inch in scale. And sanding them individually to get them to exactly the same length is, I mean, that's a little tedious. So I do have a way of making them more the same length, and that is to run them through a table saw. But that's a different issue. Anyway, you are correct to sense that there might be a problem keeping the courses level. I figure the brick, and using individual bricks is just kind of interesting, but it's so tedious that very few people are gonna be really interested.
Well, it does solve the problem of the, and you touched on it just briefly, that the brick coursing aligns realistically at the corners, as
Yeah.
opposed to dealing with how do you join, even two beveled panels
Right.
so they look right.
Right.
Yeah, I thought that way of doing the corners was excellent. Well, it's very prototypical.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments for Ron?
Going back to earlier in the clinic where you were showing your jig for assembling your 2x4 studded walls.
Yes.
How do you keep the actual walls once you're assembling them and gluing them together? How do you keep them from sticking to the surface?
Oh, well, mainly that's just by using a styrene jig and wood glues. They stick a little bit, but you can pry them off without breaking them apart. Aleen's that I use anyway will hold wood to styrene if you don't mess with it, but it will release gracefully if you do mess with it.
I see.
Well, that corner jig like you built with styrene. Many years ago, there was a modeler in this area, Ken Schmelzer, who was an excellent modeler, and he built virtually all of his structures board by board.
Mhm.
And one of his tips was a corner jig like that, and he made his out of wood. But building one out of styrene makes a lot of sense because
Yeah,
you're not gluing your. In fact, when you showed your wood spacers, I think for similar reasons, I would be tempted to make the spacers out of styrene. So I didn't
Well-
risk gluing the spacers to the wall.
yeah, yeah.
But
That
you
would
keep
work.
them a little shorter like you did, and it doesn't seem too difficult to avoid that. So
Yeah. Well, frankly, I'm a recovering woodworker, and so I do almost anything I can do with wood, I do with wood. But
yeah. Okay, anybody else? Any other questions?
Very enjoyable.
Yes, thank you very much for doing this. That was excellent. I really liked the contrasting, a couple of different construction methods and then modeling different types of prototypes. That was very good.
thank you.